Hello, explorers. Thanks for joining us again and welcome back to our channel. We have a very exciting episode today. I will be looking as to the reason why the continent of Africa must start walking the ropes to prepare the two countries that will represent Africa at the United Nations Security Council with veto powers. We all know how this conversation has had contentions across Africa's geopolitical circles. It is important for Africa not to take off its eye on the ball.
When is the African Union going to decide on the two African seats, though? I mean, it's been talking about two seats in a very abstract way. Who is it going to be? There are 54 African countries. Who's going to occupy the two seats? You have to decide, really.
You could not decide when there were no two seats. They were not there. So you could not even have that discussion. The first battle that we had.
But I've just used the G4 example. They've told you that we don't know how many seats they're going to get, but they're at least saying we want them.
Yeah, but we don't have that luxury. We do not have those two seats. We must first fight that those two seats must be allowed. They must be there. Then we will be able to say these are the countries. But as I've said,
Africa should not be distracted. You must focus on what's happening in Washington, including Brussels, Beijing, including Moscow, and also in Paris, because that's where the geopolitical decisions are being made that will affect your decision making and your voice in the world. Today, I just want to look at the recent question that came from a reporter with regards to Africa's Security Council's position. And the question was based on, would Africa's representative at the Security Council be a democratic country or a non-democratic country? Let me put it that way. The United States of America's ambassador at the United Nations struggled to explain that particular position. For example, if Africa choose Mali, Burkina Faso, or South Africa, or Nigeria to represent them, would that be a decision from the African Union, or will it be basically a decision that being made in Africa's geopolitical circles? And would the United States of America or its geopolitical partners refuse who should represent Africa at the United Nations Security Council with veto powers? I think Africa should be the one to make that decision, but it appears that there will be a vote that will be out there to decide who represents Africa. But the question here is, if Africa decides to put a country which Western partners consider not being democratic, would they have to refuse that? We have countries at the United Nations Security Council that have very disgraceful records. If countries that represent Africa at the Security Council be countries that are not considered to be democratic, will the United Nations refuse those countries from Africa? That's the question I really want to know. Because this question that was posed is a tricky one. And I want African countries to pay attention on what's happening in their geopolitical circles, or what their geopolitical partners are thinking about this decision in the future. You can't just make decisions, just thinking about this thing's going to happen, but you have to anticipate the way you work with your partners. Let's roll this clip and we will dive into this topic because it's very important for Africa to know what its partners are thinking about its future decision with regards to Security Council's veto power.
Hi, David Smith of The Guardian. Just wonder if you could talk a bit about the proposal for two African seats on the UN Security Council. Is it possible sometimes those would be non-democratic countries, and does that concern you? And then a second question, just generally in your reflections on the US's relationship with African countries, and is there still a perceived struggle there with China for influence?
Look, the Africans will choose their two seats on the Security Council. It's not for us to make that choice, and then they have to be voted on in the General Assembly and supported by broadly by the Security Council. We have countries on the Security Council that are sometimes not democracies, but I would hope that in making its choices for the Security Council, that African countries will choose countries that will be able to represent their broadly their interests.
I think you just had it pretty clear there. Will the country that Africa choose represent the interest of the world, or it will be the interest of African countries? Because if African nations choose for example, Botswana, to represent them at the United Nations Security Council with veto powers? Would they refuse? Or they decide to choose a country they consider not being a democratic country? Because that's where the problem will be. Africa has to be ready on this topic, because choosing someone is one thing, and how the geopolitical partner perceive that particular country will be another thing. We have countries at the United Nations Security Council that have very disgraceful record. And a number of those countries are focused on their own interest. And Africa should address this topic before the time comes. That's where the problem is. And Africa has to be preemptive with regards to this decision. We will look into some other aspect. So I brought this up to let African geopolitical experts understand where their geopolitical partners sit. We haven't known what the interest of those countries will be, but Africa will decide what country sits there. And there are 54 countries in the continent of Africa. If Africa chooses a country, it should be for the Africa's interest, not going through the long process like what the ambassador is explaining there that will bring issues. So we all shall be watching what's going to happen. On the question with regards to the United States of America's relationship with the continent of Africa, I think the message has started sinking into Washington. Washington now understands why African nations are free to make their choices. The notion that the United States will tell African nations who to work with, or they have to work with just them, I think that message is clear. The US now does understand that African countries have the right to make strategic choices, and that's what the ambassador went ahead to explain where the American position lies. With such conversation, it gives the African countries a point to note that they are also making choices that would affect their own interests. Remember, African countries have not said that they don't want to work with any other geopolitical partners or just the United States or China or Russia. They want to have choices, and they are free to make that as sovereign nations. Let's roll the clip.
And I'm sorry, the second question?
Just your reflections more generally on US influence in Africa, and many people talk about a big competition there with China.
Look, I have been working on Africa for almost 40 years. I've served as the Assistant Secretary for Africa during the Obama administration, and our relationships across Africa are good. And while there's always this sense that we're competing with China on Africa, we have been actively working with Africans on the continent since the beginning. We were one of the first countries I think we were even the first country to recognize Ghana, and we continue to have close relationships across the board with African countries. We're not telling African countries that they can't choose to have relations with China. That's a choice that they have to make. What we have to do is be able to give them a choice.
On the question of representation from the continent of Africa, the South African foreign minister said South Africa will seek one seat. The question here is which other country will join South Africa? What South Africa is simply saying that they are ready to put in their candidacy for the continent of Africa, and which other country in the continent of Africa will be able to put forward that. I think it's a good way to be preemptive with regards to this particular very important topic, that Africa will engage its own interest at the United Nations Security Council. The question was posed to the Foreign Minister of South Africa, Mr. Ronald. Let's listen to the way he answered that question, and we will close this episode.
Minister, you've seen the US proposal in support of 2 African permanent seats in a future reformed UN Security Council, but without the veto. The US has been quite explicit that it has no intention of giving up its veto, but that extending it to others was simply not going to happen. What do you make of the US proposal, given that it flies in the face of the AU's common position, contained in the Eswatini Consensus, that as long as the veto exists as a matter of common justice, it should be available to all permanent members, new and old?
Yes, that remains the position of the AU, the Eswatini Consensus. And it is a position based on the fact that, as you are aware, most of the conflicts happen mostly in the global south, particularly in the African continent and other parts of the world. But we are seized by this huge challenge that the Security Council deals with in our continent, and it is in that context that we are of the firm view that the veto power remains important. But we think that the proposal by the US should be seen and be welcomed as a step in the right direction in terms of engagement. Something is now on the table. They have put it that will enable this discussion to happen. As you will be aware, it has been taking long for quite some time. They have now moved to at least say we can shift to this level of 2. It means that there is something that we can further persuade them, or they can persuade us with regards to the Ezulini consensus in taking this matter further. And we think that engagement has to continue to happen.
Africa has, of course, called for 2 permanent seats for Africa and an additional 5 non-permanent seats on a rotational basis. And what we are now hearing from this long-standing intergovernmental negotiation process, that it's time for Africa to indicate, Minister, who its preferred 2 permanent seats are going to be. There's a group called the G4 in these negotiations: Brazil, India, Japan, and Germany. They are all seeking permanent seats for themselves, so they're very specific about what they want. Has the time not come for Africa to show its hand? And let me ask you, is South Africa going to vie for one of those permanent 2?
Yeah, we will definitely show our hands, and that should happen at the platform of the AU. But also, as you are aware, these 2 permanent seats are seats at the United Nations. So there is that kind of dynamic relationship that will also have to respect at that platform, that the platform is given the space to then take this Africa initiative forward for these 2 permanent seats. And South Africa will always avail itself to play a role in these important platforms.
When is the African Union going to decide on the 2 African seats, though? I mean, it's been talking about 2 seats in a very abstract way. Who is it going to be? There are 54 African countries. Who's going to occupy the 2 seats? You have to decide, really.
You could not decide when there were no 2 seats. They were not there. So you could not even have that discussion. The first battle that we had.
But I've just used the G4 example. They've told you that we don't know how many seats they're going to get, but they're at least saying we want them.
Yeah, but we don't have that luxury. We do not have those 2 seats. We must first fight that those 2 seats must be allowed. They must be there. Then we will be able to say these are the countries. But as I've said, South Africa will always avail itself to participate and play a role in multilateral platforms of the AU and that of the United Nations.
So to be clear, South Africa wants to be a permanent member of the Security
Council. We will participate, yes.
We want to thank you for watching. Hopefully we've informed you with regards to this very important strategic issue in the continent of Africa, why African nations should be prepared with regards to choosing countries that will sit at that Security Council with veto powers to make a decision that reflect the interests of the continent of Africa, as those other 5 permanent members have been making decisions that also have their own interests. For now, we are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. We'll encourage you to smash the like button and share the video with your different network, and watch other informative content on our YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you again in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.